begin with some words of George MacLeod. George MacLeod was the founder of the Iron community. Yes, most of you heard of him or are familiar with him. So these are some words of his. Almighty God, Creator, the morning is yours, rising into fullness. The summer is yours, dipping into autumn. Eternity is yours, dipping into time. The vibrant grasses, the scent of flowers, the lichen on the rocks, the tang of seaweed, all are yours. Gladly we live in this garden of your creating. Listen to these words. People who know it might envisage Iona in the scent of flowers and the lichen on the rocks and the tang of seaweed, or other places. And I want to begin by thinking about favourite places that we have. And I guess all of us have some place that, for us, really speaks to us, really moves us. So I want you to spend just a couple of minutes calling to mind places, a place that is a favourite place for you. And then when you've thought about it, and just imagine yourself there for a couple of minutes, and then share with the people around you, or turn around to the people behind you, and just tell them a little about your favourite place, or a favourite place. People have more than one of them. That was just a little song, Thatcher's song, which is a wonderful description of somewhere that is a favourite place for me. It's a song called Thrift, and it's all about salt marshes and rock pools and it just brings to mind for me this place. and place, our favourite places, speak to us in a particular way. The instinct to worship in response to the beauty and mystery of the universe is as old as the human story itself. The passionate outpourings of psalmists and poets is collectively a great song of praise in which the songs of the Spell Song Collective add the latest chapter. And that song of praise echoes down the centuries and still resonates today in the hearts of everyone who's ever looked out over mountain ranges folded into blue mist, or at innumerable stars over the desert, or across a sparkling sea, and wondered. That song of praise for the intricate delicacy of a leaf unfurling, for the massive solidity of granite and basalt, for the corn high in the field and the horse racing across a meadow, has moved humankind to express its love for the earth, our home, in thousands of ways. In the late Middle Ages, the poets and singers of Scotland were known as makers, and I think it's not too fanciful to imagine the universe as the song of God the Maker, a joyous outpouring of energy and creativity and wild ordering and continuous exchange. And it's truly a religious instinct to respond to God's song-making with our antiphon of praise. The earth makes worshippers of us. There's something rather touching about the God we meet in Genesis 2, so profoundly human in his making, in his activity, modelling a man out of the earth's clay, animating, literally breathing life into him, then planting a beautiful garden full of magical trees and treasure for him to live in. But the man himself is as much a part of the earth as all the other forms and species. His very name, Adam, links him with the ground, Adama, the ground of his being. He is created, not creator. The failure to acknowledge creatureliness has been a big problem for human beings ever since, and an even bigger one for the other life forms we share the earth with. Our tendency to assume that the universe is at our disposal, that it has no intrinsic worth other than its utility to the human species, has made us careless to the point of extreme culpability. We are destroying nature at an unprecedented rate, threatening the survival of 1 million species. It's a kind of blasphemy. How can we pray with integrity? How can we live gladly in the garden when we are so cavalier with our own habitat? The Scottish journalist Kenneth Roy once described a visit he made to an island in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, to a remote village where life was hard every day, if not any longer as grinding as it had once been, and where the local history had been marked by a number of fishing tragedies of the kind that desolates small, close communities. He joined the local Free Church congregation for worship, and here in a liturgy bereft of any relief of colour, movement or visual imagery, plain in the extreme, he found himself addressed by what he termed the unbearable fact of God. The austerity of the worship reflected that of the landscape itself, barren, rocky, battered by Atlantic gales, where little grows in thin soil and the harvest of the sea is hard won, and yet with a stark beauty in its simplicity and quality of light. It is for me a powerful image of the way in which our environment acts and interacts with our self-understanding. Does a particular habitat create its own meaning, predisposing its inhabitants to interiorize and signify their external surroundings? Could such an austere religious landscape exist in a similar way in the gentle wooded slopes and fertile valleys of southern England, for example? Or is meaning sought to make some kind of sense of the particularities of place? The inhabitants of an even bleaker island, St Kilda, many miles off the north coast of Scotland, were taught by their clergy, and believed it wholeheartedly, that the illnesses, poverty and hardship they suffered, and the tragic loss of so many babies at birth, actually caused by bad midwifery practices, was punishment from God because they were a wicked generation. We know that before they ever have language, babies perceive the world through their senses, bombarded with sensory messages in every moment of every day. As language and relationship with the people in their environment develops, some of that early sensory awareness is dulled. But the sense of place, of surroundings, that is a significant factor in our interpretation of the world, has its roots in some of our first experiences. It lays foundations for our relationship to our location, whether we will like it or not, whether it nurtures us or not, whether we have a feeling of belonging in it or one of alienation. It affects our response to such concepts as nature and land and home. A sense of place is one of the most profound human experiences. For many people, it's stronger than their attachment to other human beings. It's part of what motivates patriotism, nationalism, artistic expression, religious devotion, ecological concern, personal and political identity. This last century, and especially the last 30 years or so, have seen an increased ecological awareness worldwide. From the effects of global warming to the pollution of lakes and rivers, the destruction of rainforests, and the threat to biodiversity, all the way to concern about localized ecosystems. The fate of the earth, in its unity and its diversity, has moved up the public agenda. We have begun to realize that our habitat is indivisible, that what affects one part ultimately affects all parts, that when one part of the body suffers, all the other parts suffer with it. No longer tied to old concepts of dead matter, we know that we inhabit a living earth. This increasing awareness is changing our maps Our geology is in constant transition, and our interior geography is also shifting. But the maps are not all the same. There are many different attitudes to what we call nature, our habitat, our Earth in its universe. These can include nature, you can listen to them and think as you go of examples of each of these. Nature as a resource to be managed. Nature as an opportunity to be exploited. Nature as a potential to be developed. Nature as an aesthetic to be appreciated. Nature as the stage on which human destiny is worked out. Or simply nature as a nice surrounding in which to take exercise, conquer mountains, or escape the pressures of modern living. There is a proposal at the moment to create a very large, what would you call it, amusement park, theme park, on the shores of Loch Lomond, called Flamingo Land. Everyone who lives in Scotland should find out about this, because it will involve a large hotel, hundreds of houses, a very large shopping complex, and a lot of car parking spaces. Almost all of these attitudes are displayed in this proposal, which is being fiercely opposed by the local people and by many people in Scotland. Loch Lomond is a kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of a symbolic loch for people in Scotland. You know, the bonny banks and all that. All of these attitudes to nature are not attitudes of extrinsic worth. That is to say, they add value to nature in terms of its desirability to the human race. But there are different attitudes of intrinsic worth. These have different names. Deep ecology, creation spiritualities, they have different origins and different expressions. And they include indigenous traditions and communities, often followers of pagan religions. Some movements or groups within the historical world religions, such as Zen Buddhism, Hindu yoga, Sufi mysticism, the Jewish Kabbalah, and in Christianity, the rediscovery and re-evaluation of the insights and practices of Celtic Christianity, of the Rhineland mystics and the Franciscans, along with the growth of modern green movements within all the religions. We can also find what might be called a scientific spirituality, motivated in study and research by the intrinsic beauty, complexity, and just sheer awesomeness of the universe. But perhaps most numerous are those individuals and groups who would not necessarily place themselves in any of these categories, but are simply people for whom and to whom the universe speaks in the language of love, and who respond with love and respect and the desire for ecological justice. These categories don't have rigid boundaries, and there's considerable overlapping between them, but they share a dominant common characteristic. Their profound motivation is one of reverence and respect for the forms and elements and species of the earth, because they have intrinsic value, and because we are part of them, connected to them, a species among species, programmed to adapt and survive. A species amongst species. Though we may have an intellectual awareness of this in our society, it's still somewhat difficult to take it on board. Even with a deep conviction of intrinsic worth, we still have problems of perspective, and the pressures to disconnect are very acute. We recognise the fact that indigenous or tribal cultures often have highly evolved ways of living in relationship with their habitat. These ways are highly unitive, deeply connected. They have lived in a relationship of undivided wholeness, in which even the term reverence for nature is inaccurate, because it conveys rather too much over againstness for a context in which such a degree of differentiation has not been conceived of. But such cultures, which have often been torn up by the roots from the land on which they grew, by the forces of what is sometimes rather misleadingly called development, or even progress, are forced at an accelerated pace into a brutal differentiation which is almost unimaginable for us in our highly individualistic culture. Western cultures have had centuries of this brutalization. We have been torn up by the roots so often. Uprooted, it's harder for us to know ourselves as a species among species. And if one part of religion is the attempt to conceive of the universe as humanly meaningful, there is also the temptation to interpret that as meaning that humankind is what the universe is for. And thence it is only a small step to the arrogance of believing that the universe is for us, making us the value adders to creation. That's quite a complex way of, I hope that's clear in what I said. So I think it may be for us a considerable struggle to affirm that, on the contrary, we are for the universe. But it's a change I think we have to make. But in our relationship with our own habitat, the sociological and historical pressures running against connectedness are very acute. And though a scientific spirituality may have a clearer picture of our ecological dependence, and at the moment there are scientists all over the world taking very extreme measures as scientists, gluing themselves to barriers and climbing up, and this is scientists who are desperate at the failure of people either to hear their message or to understand it or to feel bothered to do anything about it. And even science is still subject to the pervasive and persuasive strategy of making the ends justify the means in a value-loaded, anthropocentric way, as conflicts about everything from animal testing to fossil fuels demonstrate. Being a species among species, recognizing our connections also means recognizing our finiteness, our contingency, our limitations. This presents huge problems to Western cultures living with economic and political ideologies that are, after all, the logical conclusion of the Enlightenment, that movement which brought many gifts, some of them poisoned. We live in a society which entices with limitlessness, and offers the promise of escape from the demands of finiteness. Both personally and politically, on the left and on the right, our society entices us to disengage from the confines and demands and limitations of history, of geography, of bodies, of relationship. We repress, distort, deny our history, the hurts done both to us and by us. We attempt to leap over geography in our cars and planes, cause carnage on the roads and poison the atmosphere. We systematically demean, degrade, armour and hurt bodies. We very often pay lip service to community, live out of individualism, and pay to find ways of recreating a more spurious community. Jonathan Porritt, searching for the reasons why people do not take ecological issues seriously enough, said, "Simply not enough people are dying yet in our countries of skin cancer, of UV rays, or from pollution toxification illnesses. Nor are enough coastal communities drowning yet from rising sea levels due to global warming. The visible, tangible, avoidable consequences of eco-disaster are not yet powerful enough to persuade sufficient people to change today's priorities. But we know in the last 30 years, the increase in these things happening in this country, in Western Europe, is absolutely stark and visible. It just doesn't seem to be enough as yet. Is this what we are headed for in the West? Is our denial of reality so great, our denial of our finitude and the planet's finitude so strong, that having rolled back our boundaries so firmly over other people and species, having externalized our costs to such a degree, we have lost the ability to self-limit and must wait for the limitations laid upon us by catastrophe and tragedy. Freethinker, do you think you are the only thinker on this earth in which life blazes inside all things? Your liberty does what it wishes with the powers it controls. But when you gather to plan, the universe is not there. So much of our relationship with our habitat today is mediated. We are a very long way indeed from the book of Job, whose writer draws continual attention to our embeddedness in the natural world in the story of Job. Can papyrus grow where there is no marsh? Can reeds flourish where there is no water? While yet in flower and not cut down, they wither before any other plant. I love that. This is a man, I assume it's a man, who knew so much about his habitat, knew far more than most people in our society today know about ours. But ask the animals and they will teach you. The birds of the air and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being. The other species of the earth are invited to bear witness because we are in community with them and because we are in community with the writer of Job. Job was called to let God be God. Even with all our scientific understanding, what we know about the universe is so much less still than what is still mysterious to us. The universe, in all its complexity and beauty, moved a quantum physicist to say that the appropriate response to it is one of sheer wonder and love. But such a celebration requires the dethronement of human ego and cooperation with nature rather than domination over it. In the close and patient observation of creatures in the wild, human beings discover the nature of them, their particularities, their strength, the way in which their creatureliness is similar and yet different. It is in the nature of human beings to be in dialogue, to ask a question, to start a conversation, to yearn for communication. The book of Job is a dialogue between Job and his creator, and it still has huge power to move us because it challenges a particular kind of pious orthodoxy, the easy linkage of virtue and prosperity, and the equally shallow linkage of sin and suffering, both of which still disfigure the church today. This dialogue speaks to us of real life. That the dialogue continues still, despairing and yet hopeful, is a gift and a cause for celebration. This is the dialogue of life. And what is our dialogue? Of course, this is a huge question and challenge. For the fantasy of transcendence, of escape from connection with other lives, we are torching our life support systems, as George Monbiot puts it. When I was preparing this presentation, I read something that he had written. Travelling by kayak, I cover less sea and must stay closer to the coast than the people racing past in power boats. But I have an intimacy of connection with the places and living systems that surround me, with the sounds of nature, with signs too subtle to see at speed, sand eels stippling the surface, the dorsal fins of bass pursuing them, holographic sea gooseberries suspended in the water column, cowries eating star ascidians on the rocks exposed at low water, of which they are likely to be deprived. For me, living in the middle of a city, my connection with my habitat, my place, is greatly enabled by paying close attention, by observing and listening and using my senses in an intentional way. Here too, our bodies are gifts. I want to play you a song about trees because I live in a bit of a city that has many trees. But then I want to come back to this altogether. we're not accustomed really to thinking of the places where we live as our habitat. But they are, and they provide for us the things that we feel that are necessary for our survival. But they're also part of a bigger ecosystem, if you like. What I'd like to invite people to do now is to maybe get into slightly, move your chairs, you know, where you're in with maybe 4 or 5 people, and talk about what do you think it means to be attentive to your habitat? What are the particular features that characterize your habitat? So my habitat is in the middle of really what's a post-industrial city, but I live in a part of it which is it's a kind of it's a university area, and it's characterised by very wide streets, by old Victorian architecture, and by a lot of lime trees, and also some, you know, parks and things. One of the things I like about it is that it's that much lambasted by the Tories thing. It's a 15-minute neighbourhood. I can get everything I want in 15 minutes by walking, you know, with 15 minutes walking. Within that area, that 15-minute diameter are parks, shops, hospital, clinic, dentists, theatres, library. I mean, it's a wonderful 15-minute neighbourhood and very good transport links. So it means I can not have a car very happily. But in that regard, it's a very privileged place, and it's not the habitat of a lot of people. So, is that a clear request, suggestion? Thank you. Going to groups of about 4 or 5.